I was 30 years old and I come from a small town in Scotland, in the southwest of Scotland, Stranraer.
And your name?
Willie Scobie. Hobbies? Well, I used to do a lot of swimming and just generally football, playing a bit with the boys of my own age. And, at that time there was a lot of dances on where I come from. So we used to go every Saturday night to the dance, and that was a big thing to look forward to. Television was just black and white at that time. It wasn't even colour. In the 80s we were just moving into that, so there was a lot of soaps to what we got today. Saturday night you always got a movie, and people used to come round to the house and just watch the movies, and so we were fortunate that we had a television. So that's what I spent most of my time then.
And what sort of music do you listen to?
Music. I didn't do a lot of listening to music because I was more into the trade union and labour movement, so I didn't do that. That was more for the wife to listen to. But that was the start of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and there was a lot of following then, both mods and rockers. So that was the big thing then.
Yeah, do you remember Live Aid?
Yeah, I remember Live Aid, and that was one of the first times that groups actually got together under Bob Geldof, and he got all the groups that were performing just to try and raise money for Ethiopia and to raise money because of the famine that was going on there, and it was a huge success. I watched it, and as I was saying, it was a great thing. It was started to tackle some of the poverty, the people who are starving in third world countries, and it was a great initiative of Geldof in what he did. Indeed, he was knighted for it, and so all the bands came together all the time just to make sure that they could raise that money. They went to feed the people who were starving, the kids who were dying of hunger. In the 80s, well, and I was married then, so it was just, I was into jeans, and we had moved in the 60s to the 70s. It was all flares and bell bottoms and everything, moving into the 70s. So I was married then, and Saturday night was, you dressed up, you suit, your tie, and everything else. But casual wear was jeans and denim jacket. That type of casual clothes. No, I can't remember. What the styles were like though. We'd moved away. The 60s, as you talked about in the 70s, were right into the hippie movement and then moving in. So people become more liberal in what they were wearing, and they were quite free in what they wore. Oh, the shoulder pad, and you got suits that come in with a shoulder pad. You thought you were 3 feet wide, so you did, you were down to buttons, the tailors, and that was a big thing. I noticed earlier one of your crew was running around with a donkey jacket on, and that was the big thing then as well. Everybody had a donkey jacket, and that was just a casual jacket with a bit of, it wasn't even leather, it was plastic along the back. So it was very much into casual. There was a difference between casual and then formal wear. In the 80s, I was living, we got ourselves, my wife and I got ourselves a council house, a social house in Stranraer, and that was about the 74, 75, and we lived in a council house and have lived there ever since. It was a 2-bedroom house, with a living room, kitchen, bathroom, back and front garden. It was a terraced house. There was 4 in the terrace. The neighbours were a bit older than what I was, and it was. I brought up to a family in the 2-bedroom house, boy and a lassie. So it was good. We had good neighbours. There wasn't much trouble. It was a quiet area that I lived in. Well, I actually was brought up in a four and a block up in what they call the Dix Hill of Stranraer. It was, wasn't so rough then as it is today. So we moved out to what was the East End of Stranraer, and that was where we regarded where all the toffs lived. So the wife and I moved out there, and I left a lot of my friends that I grew up with in a very much working class estate. So this was me moving up, staging myself. But a lot of my friends then started to get houses in and around me. So, I was growing up with people that I knew and that I palled about with in my teenage days. There was a better sense of community from where I came, living up in the Dix Hill, but there was still a community, a sense of community. But I think the wife knew more people out where I brought up my children than what I knew. I still related back to my days of being brought up in a different area of Stranraer. I think that was a divisive movement by Thatcher and the Tory government at the time. It was to try and move people into this sense of belonging, something that I owned, and then it changed whole attitudes, that they actually owned something rather than relying on social housing and everybody being brought up the same. They disguised it as, this was her doing for the family. So everybody became property owners, and I opposed it for many, many, many years. People strived to think they became property owners, they owned their own house, and maybe that was the positive side to it. But in doing so, they deprived other people coming forward that required social housing. The amount of money that we were selling council houses, social housing for, never ever replaced the number of houses that we needed for the people that were coming behind us. So for what they were selling, it didn't replace. And local authorities still had a lot of debt. She did it with a clear purpose. And, people became property owners. They had big mortgages to pay. As soon as there was any strife at places of work, then people thought about, do I really want to take on the bosses of the day? Do I really want to go and strike for something that they felt, was their entitlement? So people started to shy away from the idea that they took on the bosses. So that was their purpose. It was deliberate. It was divisive in how they treated the working class. In Scotland, indeed anywhere, and particularly in Scotland, social houses then, they put out a ballot to all the tenants to see whether they wanted to remain with the local authority or go to a different landlord. And in the area that I come from, Dumfries and Galloway, they decided that they wanted to move away from the local authority and go into a housing landlord. The wife was always keen to buy, and when they moved away from local authority into the social landlord, the housing association, she eventually got her way, and we eventually bought the house, very much against my will. I think it was a bad idea, and still believe it was a bad idea. In Scotland now, we've introduced different legislation under devolved government, and we now have taken away the right to buy, because it wasn't replacing the number of houses that we needed for people that were coming on that couldn't get onto the housing ladder, and they needed social housing and still need social housing. My job in the 80s, well, maybe if I go back 3 years to the 77 when I got the sack for trade union activities. And in the 80s, I was blacklisted in a small town of about 12,000 to our population. So I took a lot of dead-end jobs. I was a lorry driver. I worked on a ferry for a summer season. I took whatever I could. I was a baker to trade. And I went along to the bakery where I used to work, and he says, I could employ you, but you're too much into the trade union. So I just had to take whatever was coming. I had 2 ends to feed and a wife to keep, so I had to take whatever was going. I remember standing outside a ship breaking only 6 miles away from me in Cairnryan, and we were breaking up the Ark Royal, which was the largest aircraft carrier. I think it may have been built on the Tyne, and people were standing outside the gates, can I get a job, mister? Can I get a job, mister? And you were hand-picked for days' work, just a day's work, trying to bring in money. I was never picked, but however, in jobs where, you know, people were sent in with crowbars to break up the Ark Royal, and the Ark Royal was full of asbestos, so it was, and folk were subjected to this asbestos with crowbars. It was horrendous. But that was the type of work, and if you were unemployed as I was, you had to take whatever was going. I was a bus driver at the time, and I worked in a national company, Western SMT, and I was the shop steward. I was the trade union representative, and there was 24 drivers, and that supplied the whole of the south west of Scotland, the Western SMT, from Kilmarnock to Stranraer to Dumfries and all over. And of all the depots that the Western SMT had in the southwest of Scotland, that caused them the most problems because I was fighting for the rights of the workers. We were trying to get better conditions, better working conditions, and I was effective in what I was doing, but they eventually just sacked me, and I took it to an industrial tribunal, and the industrial tribunal said, or the company says, we'll pay you any amount of compensation, we're just not having you back. So I never get back, and I never drove buses since. Yeah, we went out on strike. We went to work to Rule. We used to do Stranraer. It wasn't Stranraer, London. It was a Belfast, London, and we picked it up in Stranraer. And we used to stop the buses. Just, you know, we used to do a Belfast, Blackpool, and they used to do up and down in a one. And I insisted that you needed 2 men on that to work within the road traffic regulations, that you needed 2 drivers. And the company just, but I held them to what it said in the rules. So it was more cost effective to get rid of me than keep me there. So that was why. We moved from the 70s into the 80s, and we were facing massive increase of unemployment. Thatcher came about, and Thatcher was about destroying workplaces. She started with the miners and the miners' strike in the 84s. From the miners' strike, we then saw the demise of the steel industry, and then shipbuilding became non-existent. So these were the big industrial areas, but it had a net effect on all the other jobs. So we were facing massive unemployment, and I spent the 80s going about places just marching for jobs. I was in Newcastle in one of the marches. I was in Liverpool. We marched in Stirling. We marched all over the place just against Thatcher and what she was doing to jobs. Decimating the jobs that existed. People couldn't. When I left school in the 1965, 15, no qualifications, nothing. You could walk straight into a job. Kids of the same age in the 80s could hardly find a job. There was no jobs for them. The miners' strike, that was a year-long strike, and the miners decided they would go on strike. They did it by pithead ballots, so they did. So each pit took a decision that they would go on strike, and Arthur Scargill, then all the miners came out, bar none to begin with, and then some went back. However, you know, it went on for a year. Had the miners just held their firm at that time, I think that they would have defeated Thatcher if they'd just held, because Thatcher was running out of oil. Thatcher built up an oil reserve and made sure that the big power stations were able to run without coal for that whole year. When they tried it in 74, when it was Heath, the miners defeated Heath, but in 84, Thatcher had a strategy that built up on oil and kept the big powerhouses, the energy places running. but if only the trade union labour movement had got behind what was the vanguard of the trade union labour movement was the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, we would have defeated Thatcher. Thatcher was a despised person. I hated her. I would dance on her grave. She destroyed, she devastated, firstly the miners, her and McGregor, closed all the pits and just north of me in Ayrshire, it was full of pits, and there is still a massive amount of coal down there. The northeast, carrying coal to Newcastle, as they talk about, again it was huge mining area. So she devastated the miners. She took them on in '84, and it wasn't Scargill that defeated or the miners that were defeated. It was the fact that the trade union labour movement didn't get behind Scargill. So what do I think of Thatcher? As I say, I would dance on her grave for what she did to working class and the jobs in this country.
So, what do you think of Margaret Thatcher?
I hated Margaret Thatcher. We came through the 70s and the 80s under Thatcher as the Prime Minister, and her whole intent was to destroy the trade union movement. So it was, she started with the miners and then she went through the whole big industries. She brought in McGregor for America with the sole purpose of destroying, to take on the miners and the miners' union, and he was hell bent on destroying the trade union and the trade union movement, to literally close all the pits. And that's what Scargill warned them against, that eventually if they didn't stand up against Thatcher, they would have the pits closed in Great Britain, just to what we've got just now. It was devastating for the families, and we spent that full year, people who weren't in the mining industry, we spent the whole time just collecting money on the street, just so that we could feed the families or miners, and just to make sure that they had something to eat. It was devastating for the families. It was devastating for communities, because what happened then was that as the year went on and on and on, then people were desperate, and we started to get scabs and people returning to work. So she knew what she was about. She knew that eventually, and she had big cordons of police, and they weren't just police. They were brought in. They were soldiers. So they were soldiers that were dressed up in police uniforms, and they just attacked the miners that were on the picket line, and we had our grave, we had the different pits, and miners were killed. So they were just defending their right to work. She had a strategy. I've already said the Tories were defeated under Heath in '74. She took them on in '84, so she did, but she built up a reserve of oil to feed the power stations, so that she could keep the power running, so they didn't depend on the coal. So that was her whole intention. Then she started to bring in anti-trade union laws on the right to strike, how many people could stand in a picket line, how they elected their representatives. She was out to destroy the trade union movement, and nobody was standing against her, other than the miners. The miners were the vanguard of the trade union movement.
So why she do that?
She did it in the whole ethos of capitalism. It was all about, how much more money could we make? How much profit could we, not to be shared amongst the folk, amongst workers, and making sure that they had proper working conditions, that their wages were correct and everything else. This was to make people rich and powerful. And so they had to destroy the trade union movement and then working class people. She just devastated and demoralised a lot of good people. destroyed many communities. We actually ended up with families no talking to families, communities destroyed. You'll still hear it in the northeast, where folk will still no speak to another person in the community because of what took place in '84. As I say, we had the picket lines. We had masses of police there to make sure that people got through, the wagons got through. There was a big company in Scotland at the time called unionist Dodds. They were a big haulage company, and they went into the pits to haul out the coal. And every day I see a unionist Dodds wagon, I still spit on it, because they were there to destroy the strike, the '84 strike. And there were guys driving these lorries now that would never know about the strike then, but that's the legacy they left folk that were involved with the trade union movement in the '84. Kinnock was, and he was Kinnock was one at one time. He was regarded as the saviour of the left. He was left-minded. He had left politics, but he became leader of the Labour Party. He didn't put his heart and soul into the miners' strike and giving them the support that the miners needed. Kinnock and Scargill fell out on many occasions. Scargill, I remember being at a conference, Labour conference, when Scargill challenged him, and Kinnock changed his colours as soon as he thought he was going to get into power and become the Prime Minister. He fought 2 elections and lost, and I was a Labour councillor, and at one time I remember being at a rally in Stirling when Kinnock spoke at it, and I thought, that's going to be the saviour of the left. But as soon as he got into power and got positions or responsibility, he changed his politics. He changed against the miners, and he kept shouting that there should have been a national ballot when Scargill had already taken a pithead ballot and got the mandate for the folk. I think it was solidarity, and people were showing that solidarity. We were fighting lines and lines and lines of policemen, and policemen that were really soldiers, that were dressed up. We could go back to the national strike of '36, when they used to move the soldiers about, so that, people in Scotland would get a soldier for away down in the south of England, so that they didn't know each other. They were all working class, and that's what Thatcher did. Thatcher knew what she was doing, and we're still fighting now for the rights of Orgreave and everywhere else. We had to fight with whatever we could to make sure that we won that strike. They were defeated in the end.